Welcome back to Teaching World History using the World History Workbook. We're still on the section that looks at contrasting religious practices. And in this installment, we're looking at pages 87 through the end of the chapter, which is 92, plus the reading in the back. There are three readings in the back that go with this. They are all three from the Zulu middle 19th century writing on European impressions of Zulu practices. A lot of it coming from Zulu narration, though, translated into English. So that I think the kind of overarching theme, of course, is religious practice. And the religious practice in question here is described as animism, but it's very complex and it's very rich. And there are several terms right at the beginning identified on pages 87 and 88 related to animism and sort of used as an introduction to looking at these primary sources in the appendix. Primary sources are really rich, but because they're so rich, they're also very difficult. And I think I've always thought that the Zulu readings and the Confucius readings are the most difficult to read, because it's easy to let presumption interfere with particularly the young people in GE classes with their readings of these texts. And with the Confucius, there are some other problems that don't occur in the Zulu. But in the Zulu, there's also a problem of the manner of storytelling, which kind of duplicates one of the problems that students often have with the reading from the Mahabharata, that it's not told in the same order and in the same organization as stories, which many young American students are accustomed to. Of course, not all my students are American students, and I have African students who have known diviners and so on. But just for I think the majority of American students have this issue, and the majority of my students have been American. So the Zulu readings, I think we start there and then look at the project questions on the Zulu readings. Zulu readings begin on page 180 and then run through the three readings. I think the first one and the last one, so Amatongo and Healing Spirits of the Zulu, are really the principal readings. The one that appears in the text in the middle, which is becoming a diviner, this one is sort of a supplementary text, and we don't usually take time to discuss it because the other two really take up 2, 3, sometimes a full week of class periods just to work through these texts to see what is going on. There are so many really fascinating questions that come up from these readings, and so raising historical problems. One of the first ones is how does James become a diviner? How is he chosen, so to speak? He imagines that he's chosen to become a diviner. Who does he suppose has chosen him? And how does he know that? And then, of course, the process of becoming a diviner. All three of these are about the process of becoming a diviner in this traditional Zulu culture. And that also raises a lot of questions, and a lot of historical questions about organization of society, questions about medicine, questions about economy. In the third reading, the Healing Spirits of the Zulu, the diviner makes it clear that the diviner makes her living at being a diviner. So there's exchange of money. The people also travel to visit her. There's also an exchange of information leading up to that. But then specifically about James, in the process of James becoming a diviner, specific to his circumstance, and it seems from the other two readings that these circumstances are not unusual in other cases of people becoming diviners. Why, for example, does he abandon his family? Why does he abandon his religious practice? Why does he abandon his town? Why does he seems to abandon everything? He abandons, kind of dies to himself, as mystics say. And why does he need to do that to become a diviner? This is also a historical question and a historical problem. James is aware that he can't go to a specialist, a mental health specialist. I think a lot of students have suggested, well, he needs to have treatment. He needs to go to a doctor. But he says that he knows what would happen if he went to a doctor. If he went to a doctor, he would be put in the hospital, and he doesn't want to go to the mental hospital. He doesn't see this as the problem that he has, and so he believes he can work through it and resolve it through traditional practices and let it run its course. And in fact, in both of these cases, this is what happens. They, according to the stories, these people let the natural process run its course, and in the end, they get better. So this is also historical. It's also social. It's a clash between cultures, in this case colonial culture and the native culture of the Zulu. And also it appears between Christianity and whatever you could call the practice of James and of the Zulu, that he abandons his Christianity, his dream about his boat that represented Christianity and Christian belief. His boat has sunk, which is a beautiful passage, I think. So this is also kind of lurking in the background. A lot of students over the years have suggested, well, he needs to abandon his religion to return to his traditional religion. But I don't see that as what's happening in the story of James. I think in the story of James, he's abandoned everything. He abandoned his wife, and he knows that this is wrong. He believes this is wrong. He's abandoned his habits, his daily habits. He's moved out of the town. He's really abandoned his friends. He's abandoned everything, or he's left them. But he feels like he has to leave them. And as he leaves them, then he begins to sort of evolve into a new person, almost forgetting his past life. And his new person becomes filled with kind of a different culture, with songs and with words and with sleep patterns and with eating habits and with things that are practical and that are daily, that are also very different. One thing I ask students in discussion about James is, what are some of his other symptoms, and can they connect his symptoms to his disease? First, you have to establish the disease, and since the story is not told in a sort of a traditional American order, or European order for that matter, we don't know what his disease is, and we don't know the beginning until the end, and we don't know the end or we learn the end at the beginning, and all of these things. So James I think it's a good model, but very difficult to read. It requires a really close reading, and I think going through it step by step, from the beginning through to the end, is very helpful for students, because they often have very creative ideas about how to read this and about what the words mean. I've looked pretty carefully at the word for snuff in the second one, for example, and it turns out I'm pretty confident that it's snuff, that they're not getting high. It sounds like they might be getting high. And there's a number of passages in both of these readings, James and Healing Spirits of the Zulu, that I think are suggestive of something that they don't really represent, or they don't really intend. It sounds this way to a modern American audience, but I think that a closer reading makes it more clear of what it means. Healing Spirits of the Zulu is a little more kind of conventional narrative, conventional in the sense of what my students are accustomed to, and I think that it's more readable, it's more accessible. It's still pretty tricky, and there's still really important questions about worship, ancestors, traditional practice, what is the nature of medicine, the nature of professions. There are still a lot of really really rich questions that are historical, that come through in the healing spirits of the Zulu. And one of my favorites relates back to the Anglo-Saxon blessing, and a question that we commonly ask about the Anglo-Saxon blessing: are they worshiping the earth, and what does it mean to worship? This is an interesting problem in the healing spirits of the Zulu, because towards the end of the story, when the father talks about the ancestors, he calls the ancestors fools. He's very angry with them. He thinks they've made bad decisions. The ancestral grandmother is fighting with the ancestral grandfather, and they're both deceased, and yet they're still arguing. They're still fighting about what to do about the boy, to make him sick, to try to kill him, to make him better, and then the boy's father says, well, these ancestors are fools. Why didn't they just come to me in a dream? And so it raises, even though these are matters of belief and matters of faith, the practice is not. The young people did leave the village, and the young people visited the diviner, and the diviner had a hut, and the diviner had a ritual, and they paid the diviner, and all of those things are historical. Then, even maybe more significantly, they return and they do what the diviner says. They do what the diviner says the spirits told them to do. So and the boy got better, and they link the two. They believe that the boy gets better because the boy because they have done what the ancestors have told them to do. Now, I think she doesn't identify the spirits as ancestors, but there still is this ceremony which is described in some detail that's very interesting, and students find it. I've had African students who have witnessed these things in diviners' huts and diviners' houses, and they're kind of not as impressed as the American students who have never seen something like that. By not impressed, I mean I think that a lot of the African students have believed that these things happen and believe that these things may have some truth to them. They don't like them. They have not liked them. The American students, on the other hand, find them kind of more intriguing. Of course, they're exotic. But the question about the father is he worshiping the ancestors by doing what they demand, or is he denigrating them, or can you denigrate something you worship, and so on and so on. So I think that the obedience to ancestors is significant. You could say the obedience to the perception of ancestors, or the obedience to the diviner's description of ancestors, if you wanted to be carefully historical, because that is what they're doing. And so this also shows that the geographical organization of villages is in part an outcome of the animist practice and the animist belief. The relationship between this village, the boys' village, and the village that was on the same site or nearby the same site is also partly determined by the diviner and the diviner's intentions and descriptions. The project is Project 17 on page 89, and it includes these questions that I said that we often discuss in class. And I find these discussions really good. A little tricky at first, and students tend to be kind of reluctant, but once they get going, and they find out there's no judgment involved in these discussions, these aren't arguments, these are more dialogues that we have in the classroom, then they get comfortable, and they do very, very well. So question number one, how might James's symptom contribute towards him becoming a diviner and knowing what a diviner has to do, which is something that we've learned in the other two readings, but particularly in Healing Spirits of the Diviner. There we've seen somebody who's doing what James will eventually do. And he'll do it for his living. And he'll do it and maybe keep his family. And we don't know if he can return to other aspects of his previous life, if he can return to his Christian practice, his wife's Christian practice, or not. I think it's likely that he can, but he'll need to be set apart from the rest of the village. So the question asks, why does he have to do that? The second question is the other one that I've already mentioned. We worshipped, and what does it mean to worship? What kind of practice are they doing that's worshiping, and how does that reconcile with referring to them as fools? Does that make them gods? And then simply, what is animism? How are these stories animist? It's kind of the factual question here, less interpretive, and I would say it's more difficult. There's not overt evidence of animism in the way that animism is commonly defined. And then question 4, I think, is really better about animism. Then there's pages 91 and 92, mystic traditions worldwide and ancestors, and these are included because these are kind of evidence of universals in religion, religious universals, but not even just religious universals, but universals. These principles and practices of mysticism and honoring ancestors, respecting ancestors. It's a nice opportunity to compare when there are common elements, like with the comparative method, in these different religious practices. Judaism has very strong elements of ancestral honoring. So does Christianity. So does Islam. Hindu, very strong. Buddhism as well. These religious practices share something about ancestors, share something about the respect and the honoring of ancestors, but then they do it in different ways, in contrasting rituals and contrasting methods, which also sometimes look pretty similar, sort of at their foundation or at their intent. The same is true with mysticism. That all of these religious practices, from animism to Christianity, there are elements within all of those that are mystical and have some sort of sense of the unity of things, or of a creator, or something like that suggests a mystical sphere. I know that the story of Moses and the burning bush is often used as an example of both animism and mysticism. That the bush, many theologians, Jewish and Christian theologians, I'm not sure about Muslim theologians, look at the story of Moses and the burning bush as an example or a case where a person was able to see behind the physical world into the spiritual world, and it looked to the physical person like fire, and it was fire that wasn't consuming the bush, but it was a flame, and it was alive, but it wasn't, I don't believe it was hot. That's sort of the principle of animism. And animism goes back so far that nobody's sure how old it is. People aren't sure that these two kind of broadly framed practices, so to speak, ancestral honoring and animism and mysticism, that they don't go back to Neanderthal. This is how ancient they are. They may not, but they may go back in human history that far. So it's a nice way to compare, because you can compare these common elements. They're somewhat common. They're common, but they're different, and that's a real utility in historical contrast and comparison methods. There's one more thing about these two traditions, mystic traditions and ancestral traditions. That is a question of the comparative method, because both of these are universal in some form, are universal. So how did they get to be universal? Did they get to be universal by accident, by borrowing, or by shared descent? And the answer, as usual, is probably not accident. Borrowing, there's a certain amount of borrowing, but as far as we can tell, the shared elements far predate borrowing. like borrowing between Islam and Christianity, for example, or Christianity and Judaism, or Hinduism and Buddhism, or Sikhism and Buddhism. The borrowing goes back a long ways, thousands of years. But the common descent goes back even further than that. And it seems pretty clear that because these practices, both of these types of practices, existed long before and more universally than just borrowing would facilitate, then it seems that they're common by common descent. But there's another element that I want to raise about these, because there are suggestions that religious practice and belief are inherent, that it's something that humans are born with. We're certainly born with a capacity for even specifically kind of belief in God. There are neuroscientists who argue from their research that this is something inherent in the human brain, that an ability, and almost not the fact or the statement, but the propensity towards mystical belief and towards religious practice. Now, some of this is social, some of this is cultural, some of this is shared, some of this is common descent passed down through culture from generation to generation. But this does raise a question: might this also be common descent by genetics? It raises the question in the same way that the question can be asked about archetypes. If archetypes is there any shape of archetype that is actually inherited? Clearly, the ability to recognize symbolic language and images and so on is something that people are born with. That an ability to develop that or to acquire that appears to be somehow genetic. And so it asks this question also: can ancestral practices and mysticism, if those aren't inherited, do those fill a void that is inherited, or do those fill an ability that is inherited? Those are discussions that I think are really thought-provoking, really interesting, and get students interested in the religious expression and social expression of history. But I always want to keep in mind when we have these discussions that we need to stay historical, because you've probably seen, even in the discussion that I just had with myself and with you, that it's easy to venture a little bit too close to what's not historical. And that's really for another class, for a different field. But these are historical in the sense of social, economic, cultural, and how families are organized, the function of women. You could see all of those things in these readings: the roles of women, the roles of men, professional life, modern science, institutional life, colonialization. All of those things enter into these readings, and then you can look at those elements through the prism of religious practice, or you can look at the religious practice through the prism of those elements. Either one is historical, and this is what's so great about history, is you can do that. You're free to do that, but you should always have somebody nearby asking you if that's historical, and how do you know that? And that's the job of the instructor.